My name is Sarah, and I'm 26 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I worked as a delivery driver for a small independent pharmacy in the suburbs. The kind of place that still does home deliveries for elderly customers who can't make it to the store themselves. Most people don't even know these services still exist, but they do, and I was one of 3 drivers on rotation. The job was simple enough. Pick up prescriptions from the pharmacy around 4 p.m., follow the route list, knock on doors, get signatures, move on to the next house. I usually finished my route by 7 or 8 p.m., depending on traffic and how chatty the customers were. Some of them were lonely and wanted to talk. I didn't mind. It made me feel like I was doing something that mattered, more than just dropping off packages. The pharmacy served about a 15-mile radius, mostly quiet neighborhoods with tree-lined streets and houses that all looked similar. Cookie-cutter suburbs where everyone knew everyone, or at least, that's what it felt like. I'd been doing the route for almost 8 months, so I recognized most of the addresses and faces by then. But there was this one house I'd never delivered to before. It came up on my route list on a Wednesday in late October. The address was 4372 Pembroke Lane, way at the edge of our delivery zone. I remember thinking it was odd because that street wasn't on my usual route, and I'd never even driven down it before. When I plugged it into my GPS, it took me through a part of town that felt different from the rest. The houses were older, spaced farther apart, with overgrown yards and fences that looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. The sun was already setting by the time I turned onto Pembroke Lane. It was one of those streets where the trees formed a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the remaining light. There were no streetlights either, which made everything feel darker than it should have been for 6:30 in the evening. I found the house at the very end of the street. It was a 2-story colonial with faded blue siding and shutters that hung crooked. The lawn was overgrown with weeds, and there was a rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway that looked like it hadn't been opened in months. The whole place had this abandoned feeling to it, but the prescription was legitimate. I checked it twice. The name on the label was Eleanor Finch, and it was for heart medication. I grabbed the paper bag with the prescription inside and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. The porch creaked under my feet, and I noticed the windows were all covered with heavy curtains from the inside. I couldn't see any lights on, but that wasn't unusual for elderly customers. A lot of them kept their houses dark to save on electricity. I knocked 3 times and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Pharmacy delivery for Eleanor Finch." Still nothing. I was about to leave a notice and head back to my car when I heard movement inside. It was faint, like someone shuffling across a wooden floor. Then the door opened, but only a crack. A chain lock held it in place. Through the gap, I could see part of a woman's face. She looked to be in her 70s, maybe older, with gray hair pulled back tight and pale, papery skin. Her eyes were wide and glassy, like she'd just woken up, or like she was scared of something. "Eleanor Finch?" I asked, holding up the bag. "I have your prescription." She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at me through the crack in the door. Then, very quietly, she whispered, "I didn't order anything." That threw me off. I double-checked the label on the bag. "It says here, Eleanor Finch, 4372 Pembroke Lane. Heart medication?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't take heart medication." I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. "Ma'am, this came from Clearview Pharmacy. Are you sure you didn't place an order? Maybe a family member called it in for you?" "I don't have any family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she started to close the door. "Wait," I said quickly. "Can you just sign for it? Even if it's a mistake, I need a signature to show it was delivered. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble." She hesitated. For a moment, I thought she was going to slam the door in my face. But then she sighed and said, "Leave it on the porch. I'll sign." She closed the door. I stood there for a second, confused, then set the bag down on the porch railing and pulled out my phone to get her signature electronically. A minute later, the door opened again, just wide enough for her to stick a bony hand through. She scribbled something on my phone screen with a shaky finger, then pulled her hand back and shut the door without another word. I stood there staring at the closed door for a moment longer than I should have. Something about the whole interaction felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, like she was terrified. Or maybe it was the house itself, the way it seemed to swallow all sound and light. Either way, I didn't like it. I walked back to my car and sat behind the wheel for a minute, trying to shake off the weird feeling. Then I checked the delivery app on my phone to confirm the signature had gone through. That's when I noticed something strange. The signature she'd left wasn't a name. It was just a long, erratic scribble that didn't resemble letters at all. It looked more like someone had just dragged their finger across the screen randomly. I frowned and zoomed in on it, but it didn't make any more sense. I thought about going back and asking her to redo it, but honestly, I just wanted to leave. So I marked the delivery as complete and drove away. The next day, I mentioned it to my manager when I clocked in. I told her about the strange house and the woman who said she didn't order the medication. My manager, Linda, pulled up the order on her computer and frowned. "That's weird," she said. "The prescription was called in by a Dr. Raymond Holt. He's been ordering medications for Eleanor Finch for years." "Years?" I asked. She told me she didn't take heart medication. She acted like she had no idea what I was talking about. Linda shrugged. "Maybe she's just confused. Old people forget things. As long as you got a signature, we're covered." I wanted to push back, but I didn't. I just nodded and grabbed my route list for the day, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. 2 days later, the same address showed up on my route again. Another prescription for Eleanor Finch. This time, it was for blood pressure medication. I felt my stomach drop when I saw the address. I really didn't want to go back to that house, but it wasn't like I had a choice. It was my job. I arrived at 4372 Pembroke Lane just after 6 p.m. The house looked exactly the same as it had before. Dark, lifeless, and unsettling. I walked up to the porch with the prescription bag and knocked on the door. This time, I didn't have to wait long. The door opened almost immediately, but again, only a crack. Eleanor's face appeared in the gap. She looked worse than before. Her skin was even paler, and there were dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. She stared at me without saying anything. "Hi, Mrs. Finch," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I have another delivery for you." She didn't reach for it. Instead, she just kept staring at me with those wide, glassy eyes. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't keep coming here." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't like it when people come to the door," she said quietly. "He gets upset." "Who gets upset?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just shook her head slowly and started to close the door. "Wait," I said, stepping forward. "Mrs. Finch, are you okay? Is someone hurting you?" She froze. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something. But then I heard a noise from inside the house. It was a low, heavy thud, like something falling, or someone walking. Eleanor's eyes went wide with panic, and she whispered urgently, "Go, now." Then she slammed the door shut. I heard the chain lock slide into place, and then nothing. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to knock again, to make sure she was okay. But another part of me, the part that listened to my gut, told me to get the hell out of there. I left the prescription on the porch and practically ran back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with my keys twice before I managed to unlock the door. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the house in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw someone standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching me. But when I looked again, the window was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. He gets upset. Who is she talking about? A husband? A son? And why did she look so scared? The next morning, I called Linda and told her I wasn't comfortable delivering to that address anymore. I explained what Eleanor had said and how terrified she looked. Linda sighed and told me she'd look into it. A few hours later, she called me back and said she'd contacted Dr. Holt, the doctor who'd been ordering the medications. Apparently, he told her that Eleanor was a patient with early-stage dementia and that she sometimes got confused and paranoid. He assured Linda that there was nothing to worry about. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 3 days later, I was scrolling through local news on my phone during my lunch break when I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Elderly woman found dead in home on Pembroke Lane. I clicked on the article with trembling hands. It was her, Eleanor Finch. The article said that neighbors had called the police after noticing a strange smell coming from the house. When officers arrived, they found her body in the upstairs bedroom. She'd been dead for at least a week. A week? That meant she was already dead when I delivered that second prescription. But if she was dead, then who opened the door? Who signed for the delivery? I felt like I was going to be sick. I immediately called Linda and told her what I'd found. She went quiet for a long time, then said she'd call the police and give them our delivery records. 2 detectives came to the pharmacy later that day to interview me. They asked me to describe exactly what happened during both deliveries. I told them everything, including the strange things Eleanor had said and the way she looked. When I mentioned the signature she'd left on my phone, one of the detectives asked to see it. I pulled it up and handed him my phone. He stared at it for a moment, then showed it to his partner. They exchanged a look I couldn't read. "What?" I asked. "What is it?" The detective hesitated, then said, "This signature doesn't match any of Eleanor Finch's known handwriting samples, and based on the condition of the body, she couldn't have opened the door when you delivered the second prescription." I felt my stomach drop. "Then who did?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Did you see anyone else in the house? Hear anything unusual?" I thought back to the thud I'd heard inside the house and the figure I'd seen in the upstairs window. I told them about both. They wrote everything down without saying much. Before they left, one of the detectives told me that they were treating Eleanor's death as suspicious and that I shouldn't worry, but I should be careful. That was it. No explanations, no reassurances, just be careful. The pharmacy stopped delivering to that address after that. Linda told me that Dr. Holt's office had been closed for over 2 years and that the prescriptions had been ordered using stolen credentials. Whoever was calling them in wasn't a doctor. And Eleanor Finch hadn't had a prescription filled in over 5 years before those 2 deliveries. I quit the job 2 weeks later. I couldn't do it anymore. Every time I knocked on a door, I wondered who would answer. Every time I saw an empty house, I thought about 4372 Pembroke Lane. I still don't know who I saw in that house. I don't know who opened the door or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that figure in the upstairs window, watching me leave, and I wonder if they're still watching.
My name is Marcus. and I'm a 31-year-old overnight security guard at a storage facility just outside the city limits. It's one of those big places with rows and rows of units. Some climate-controlled, some not. The facility covers about 10 acres and has over 400 units total. Most of them are rented by people who need extra space for furniture, old belongings, or stuff they can't fit in their apartments. Some are rented by small businesses for inventory overflow. I've been working there for about 3 years now. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And honestly, boss, is usually pretty boring. I patrol the property a few times during the night, check the gates, make sure no one's broken any locks, and sit in the guard shack the rest of the time watching security monitors. The facility is surrounded by a chain-link fence with barbed wire on top. And there are cameras at every entrance and scattered throughout the rows. It's a pretty secure setup. The guard shack is a small building near the main entrance. It has a desk, a chair, a space heater, a microwave, and a wall of monitors showing feeds from all the security cameras. There's also a logbook where I'm supposed to write down anything unusual that happens during my shift. Most nights, there's nothing to write. But this one night, about 2 months ago, something happened that I still can't explain. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to. It started around 1:30 a.m. I was sitting in the guard shack scrolling through my phone when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like metal scraping against concrete, like someone dragging a chain or something heavy. I looked up at the monitors, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The rows looked empty, and the gates were closed. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway about a mile away. I walked toward the direction I thought the noise had come from, sweeping my flashlight across the rows of units. Everything looked normal. The locks were all intact, and there were no signs of anyone around. I chalked it up to an animal, or maybe the wind knocking something over, and headed back to the shack. But as I was walking back, I heard it again. This time it was louder, and it was definitely coming from deeper inside the facility. I stopped and listened. The scraping sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to investigate. I walked down row D, shining my flashlight on each unit as I passed. Everything looked fine until I reached unit D27. The lock was missing. I stopped and stared at it. The hasp was still in place, but the padlock that should have been securing it was gone. The door was slightly ajar, just enough that I could see darkness inside. My first thought was that someone had broken in. It happens occasionally. Usually kids looking for something to steal or a place to hang out. I pulled out my radio and called it into my supervisor. He told me to check it out, but to be careful and call the police if I saw anyone. I approached the unit slowly, keeping my flashlight aimed at the crack in the door. "Hello?" I called out. "Security, if anyone's in there, you need to come out now." No response. I reached out and pulled the door open. It creaked loudly on its hinges, and the sound echoed through the empty facility. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The unit was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and it was completely empty except for a single wooden chair sitting in the middle of the space. That was it. No boxes, no furniture, no belongings, just a chair. I frowned. It didn't make sense. Why would someone rent a storage unit just to keep an old chair in it? And where was the lock? I walked closer to the chair and noticed something strange. There were scratches on the concrete floor around it, like the chair had been dragged across the ground repeatedly. The scratches formed a rough circle around the chair, as if someone had been moving it in the same pattern over and over. I was about to leave when I noticed something else. There was writing on the back of the chair. It was carved into the wood, deep and jagged, like someone had used a knife or a screwdriver. I leaned in closer to read it. It said, "Watch them watch you." My stomach turned. I backed away from the chair and got out of the unit as fast as I could. I radioed my supervisor again and told him what I'd found. He sounded skeptical, but told me to lock the unit up and file a report in the morning. I didn't have a replacement lock with me, so I pulled the doors shut and made a note of the unit number. Then I went back to the guard shack and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. The image of that chair sitting alone in the empty unit, surrounded by scratch marks, kept replaying in my mind. And the words carved into the wood. "Watch them watch you." What the hell did that even mean? Around 3 a.m., I decided to check the security footage to see if I could figure out who had been in Unit D27. I pulled up the camera that covered Row D and started scrubbing through the footage from earlier that night. At 12:47 a.m., I saw something. A figure appeared on the screen, walking down Row D toward Unit D27. They were wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and their face was turned away from the camera. They stopped in front of the unit, opened the door, and went inside. I kept watching. About 10 minutes later, the figure came back out. They were carrying something, but I couldn't tell what it was. Then they walked out of frame toward the back of the facility. I switched to another camera to follow them, but they disappeared before I could get a clear view. It was like they knew exactly where the blind spots were. I sat back in my chair, feeling uneasy. Whoever that was, they knew the layout of the facility. And they'd been inside Unit D27 for 10 minutes. Doing what? I didn't want to think about it. The rest of the night passed without incident. And when my shift ended at 7 a.m., I wrote up a report and handed it to my supervisor. He told me he'd follow up with the rental office to see who owned Unit D27. The next day, he called me and told me something that made my blood run cold. Unit D27 hadn't been rented in over 6 months. The last tenant had moved out and never renewed the lease. The unit was supposed to be empty. But the lock, I said. There was a lock on it when I did my rounds last week. There shouldn't have been, my supervisor said. The office never put a new lock on it after the last tenant left. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. If the unit hadn't been rented, then who had been locking it? And who was the person I saw on the security footage? My supervisor told me he'd report it to the police, but I don't know if anything ever came of it. I never heard back. I worked at that facility for another month after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I walked past Row D, I'd glance at Unit D27, and every time, the door was closed. But I never checked inside again. Then, about 3 weeks after the incident, I arrived for my shift and found something waiting for me in the guard shack. It was sitting on my desk, right in the middle where I couldn't miss it. It was a padlock, the same kind we used for the storage units. And attached to it was a small piece of paper with a message written in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen on the chair. "Thanks for watching." I quit the next day. I didn't even give notice. I just left my keys on the desk and walked out. I don't know who left that lock or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Sometimes I still think about that empty unit and the chair in the middle of the floor. And I think about the words carved into the wood. Watch them watch you. I don't know what it means. But I know one thing for sure. Someone was watching me that whole time, and I never even knew it.